Hey everyone, it's Carter. Welcome to this episode of Making It Up. I've been having a blast doing this show, and I've probably put out a couple dozen episodes or so by now, and I've just met such a variety of interesting people and a variety of talented writers, ranging from romance authors to thriller novelists to sustainable living experts who write about living off the land. And today's guest was no exception. So today I talked to somebody who writes what I think has to be one of the most challenging things to write, which is historical fiction. Today I spoke to Dr. Adrian Goldsworthy, who's a British historian and novelist who specializes in ancient Roman history. So he clearly knows what he's doing. He loves it. This is what he studied, what he has a doctorate in. And, he's appeared on the History Channel documentary several times, and he's appeared on the television game show Time Commanders as an expert in Roman warfare. And, we spent some time talking about the amount of creativity that it must take in order to, not only know what episodes of history to write about that are interesting and create tension and have drama and an arc to them, but then to also know what liberties to take and what things that you never take liberty with, and make sure you have very factually represented, and then cobbling it all together into a thrilling read, right? So I can't imagine the amount of work it takes. It's so nice just to be able to make shit up and not having to worry too much about if something's factually and historically accurate or not. But this is his life, and it was great to talk to him. He's very British in a very good way. Very smart. I was a little intimidated. Of course, the stereotypical thing where the British accent makes him sound even smarter. And so, I was just trying to keep up with him. But he was a real pleasure to talk to. And at the end, we made up a chilling little story based on a Neil Gaiman book. So I hope you enjoy. This is me talking to Adrian Goldsworthy. So where are you?
Just outside Cardiff in the west of Britain. So right by the sea is about half a mile away. I can see it because I'm on top of a hill.
So do you walk outside and you can smell it and you can...
Yeah, and I'm up on top of a hill. So when the storms come in up the Bristol Channel, you know about it. And you can see them coming because you get to the point where you can't see the top of Exmoor and Devon.
Yeah.
The Devon goes to the other side of the channel. When that's gone, you've got about 20 minutes and then.
So I'm the exact opposite of you because I'm in Colorado and I'm right on the edge of the Rocky Mountains. So when our storm's coming in over the mountains, they just kind of drop down over the peaks, and then it just turns kind of black, but it's not coming from the sea. It's coming from the peaks. And you got a lovely cat behind you as well.
Yeah, sorry, there's two of them that might appear.
That's quite all right.
The usual thing of showing their bottom to the camera.
I have a series of steps that I take before I start recording, and one of them is to lock my cat up because he's a lunatic, and he will just scream and try to get into the room and jump on the door.
That's why it was easier to let them come in and out. Otherwise, they'll just be scratching and yelling outside.
He'd be jumping on the back of my chair. He'd be still shouting at me because I'm not giving him attention. So he's a problem. So did you grow up in Cardiff? Or is that where you're from?
Yeah, well, this little town's called Penarth. But yes, funnily enough, after university, the first job I got was, after I finished my doctorate, was Cardiff University. So I ended up back here, and it's a small town. I'm not really a city person. Mm-hmm. You're on the coast. There's country nearby. You can get up to London in normal times in a couple of hours if you want the libraries. And as I've normally said, they're well behaved, of course. But just fluke, and then it's a nice place to live. So yeah. I haven't seen a good reason to leave, really.
So it was a pretty quiet small town that you grew up in?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's slightly strange seeing my lad 7, seeing him playing in the same parks and on the same bits of cliffs and beaches that I did.
The same elementary schools and things like that. And
similarly, he's not at the one I went to, but it's it's just. I mean, you meet all these authors, people who live in London, and the thought of writing there just horrifies me completely.
Why?
I just don't like cities.
Yeah.
There's just too many people to. You want peace and quiet. I like when I can't think to go for a walk.
Yeah.
Walking around the streets is a lot more boring than if you've got either you're on a cliff top or looking out to sea, or you can go into the woodland or.
Yeah. It's a very romantic image that you paint in terms of like, I have writer's block. I'm going to go walk along the sea cliffs.
Well, it's not, I mean,
get inspired.
it's less dramatic landscape wise than it sounds, but it's nice. It's pleasant.
So as you were growing up, what were your parents doing?
My father had a little shop. He was a refrigeration engineer and then hurt his back. So it turned from being basically a refrigeration business to electrical goods and then all sorts. And so, we didn't have a lot of spare cash.
Yeah.
We didn't go on holiday much this thing, but it was a very close family. So I'm one of those authors that comes from a really happy childhood and background rather than all the trauma that seems to turn into creative stuff later on.
Me too. And one of the common questions I get is, well, what happened to you as a child?
Yeah.
Because I write pretty dark stuff, and I'm like, I had a wonderful childhood. Allow me to use my imagination. Not everything has to be right what you know.
That's the thing, and it's nice and all. It's controlled. You can have these adventures without having to get hurt too much.
Well, that's exactly it, and that's the same perspective that the reader goes through, right? Is they want that thrill in a safe space. And then, did you have siblings growing up?
Yeah, I've got an older brother. So, okay.
So small family.
Yeah, just the two of us. But I had 3. My mother's sister lived not very far, just a few streets away. So I had 3 cousins, 2 of them boys, similar age to us. Yeah. So it was a bit like there were 4 of us around, and then with a couple of other, close friends. There was always that sense of a broader group.
Right.
They're cousins, but they're pretty much like brothers, really. And the sister a little bit because she's that much younger than the rest of us. And the only girl out of 5 was sort of left out a bit. But now, as adults, we get on well. But
right,
as children, you thought, a little, you don't want to be followed around by this kid just doing all this stuff.
Right. And so, I mean, in addition to obviously being a prolific novelist, and even surpassing that is your depth of nonfiction and military history. When you were young, did either of those two things speak to you? I want to be a storyteller, or I'm really interested in military history. Like, what was kind of the spark there?
It's a bit of both. I mean, I had my father's cousin wrote detective stories in a modest way. So I knew there was a writer. But
was that interesting to you? Was that like strange?
The shameful thing is I've never actually read any of his books. I've always meant to, but even now, you sort of thought because you know someone somehow,
right? And
it's less my thing,
right?
But I'll get around to them one day, and I suspect they're very good. But,
was he kind of known or kind of a
moderately well known? He wrote these mostly detective stories that has sort of Agatha Christie feel, very, very period British.
They
did really well. They did quite well in the States. They did particularly well in Japan and places like there was a sort of, I think it's where people wanted the Britain they thought existed, but probably never quite did.
But to have them even publish that far abroad is, signals some degree of success, no?
Yeah, well, I think there was even a Japanese film, bizarrely, which he said they offered to let him see, but he thought, well, we're really disappointed.
Right. Yeah, right. A bittersweet thing.
Given that they'd probably changed nearly everything anyway, so
sure
to follow with. But no, I think one of the interesting things was growing up. My father had been as an apprentice, teenager at sea in the Merchant Navy during the Second World War, and then in the army at the very end and afterwards. And in this little shop he had, where we'd often be helping out, all these old blokes appeared with nothing better to do. And you get them in shops in Britain. They hang around to the point where customers must think they actually work there.
Right.
But they basically come for tea and a chat.
Yeah.
And they were nearly.
It's kind of like the pub, I guess. They're just there.
Yeah, it is.
They're just not drinking.
It's in the daytime because the opening hours were much stricter in those days back in the 70s. So I'd hear, one of them had been in the RAF in India. Another one had been again in India, was as before the war, was a regular soldier, and you'd hear all these stories of exotic places, and when the kids were around, they'd tell you, you'd hear them talking to each other, and it would be all the funny stuff.
Right.
And then you got the impression later on, by which time most of them had died. Sometimes Dad would mention these things, and you think, oh crikey, they'd been through that. But it gave me that sense that there'd been all these exciting things going on. There were great stories, but it was very human.
Yeah.
And that's what I always hoped to do with the Romans, because I was interested in them because there's Roman remains not far from where I live. So You grow up with it. It's part of my history. The Egyptians, the Greeks. Yeah, that's fine, but it's not here.
Right. When they built a road that I can walk on.
Exactly. So it felt a bit more personal. So the sort of combination of the two. I'm not sure when, but I think from fairly young, I always hoped to be able to write stories. But I was convinced I'd have to work for 20, 30 years before I could do it. And I never thought I'd make a living. So I started doing the nonfiction first, doing that.
Yeah.
I didn't know anybody who did that, and it worked out largely through chance as much as anything. And
what did you study?
Ancient history. So I did that as an undergraduate. Then I stayed on, did my doctorate straight away so I finished that by the time I was about 24, 25-ish.
So it's interesting that you say, like, first of all, even to have the awareness when you're young and wanting to be a writer and thinking like, well, how the hell am I going to make a living doing that? That's pretty profoundly aware for somebody that age, because it's the God's honest truth. And then so was the idea truly, I know you have obviously a profound interest in the subjects of your nonfiction books. But was there really this kind of business-like decision of like, I probably have a better shot of doing this professionally if I write nonfiction?
It was really coincidence. As I say, I didn't think you could make a living with nonfiction, but I'd started out on the usual academic career. I was doing part-time teaching. Then I had a post for a couple of years, the one in Cardiff that brought me back here. And then I was doing other short-term things, bits of teaching here, bits of there. And at that point, through just luck, really, my thesis was based on, drew inspiration from a book by the famous military historian John Keegan.
Sure.
The Face of Battle. I tried to do that with the Romans. And I said to them, this was an academic publisher, Oxford University Press. They printed 300 copies.
Mm-hmm. They printed copies.
You didn't get any royalties at all until they'd sold more than 500, and they didn't even start. In fact, the thing's still in print, but it's. I said, well, John Keegan was working at the Telegraph newspaper by then, and I said, well, would you send him a copy just to say thank you? And he then happened to be editing a coffee table book series of the history of warfare. Maybe didn't know somebody to do the Roman period. And there was one volume on 1,000 years of Roman military history compared to, there were about 3 just on the Second World War. 24 volume series. And so I got a contract just as my job ended. This contract came along. And because nearly everybody else was quite famous and well established, I got a really good deal. It's the same as everybody. They did a standard one.
Wow.
So having only ever been a student before, and not really knowing what money was about or anything like that. Suddenly I had this contract. The publisher liked that book, asked me to do another one, gave me a bit more money. So I wrote that. And then the contracts kept coming in. As I deliver a book, they'd say, oh, can you do another one? And there was money there. And then eventually, partly because I'd actually written a novel and I was trying to sell that, I approached some agents, signed up with one, and they didn't sell the novel, but they got me about 4 times as much as an advance for the next nonfiction book. So my biography of Caesar. And then I thought, well, frankly, I don't want to go back to the academic world anyway. This is better.
So you had an academic contract that was ending. So by the time you were writing and had sold, in advance this first volume associated with Keegan, that was your only work. You were just writing. You weren't teaching at that point.
For about 6 years, maybe more.
Okay.
I kept teaching, even if it was only one day a week.
Right. And this is all in your 20s?
Yeah, that's the thing. I was single. I didn't have a mortgage. I didn't have any of these things to worry about. I'd been really lucky because I scraped through the old system you had in Britain where you could go through university, and if you did well enough academically, the state paid all your fees and gave you a grant to live on. Yeah. Because I wasn't that lavish in my lifestyle, I'd managed to live off this, and I just about sort of used it up. And you supplement it with a bit of bits and pieces. But mine was the last year when, if you'd got a first class degree, you were guaranteed a grant to do a doctorate. And the next year you might get it, but you might not. And now, as in the States, the kids are coming out with these huge debts. So I didn't have debt. I was used to not having very much money because I'd never had any. And they kept asking me to write books. So I thought, well, this is fun. The interesting thing about writing for an audience rather than just your academic colleagues, because you do the academic stuff and you will probably meet every single person who reads that article or that book sometime. If you don't know them already, right. It's that sort of level you're talking about.
Yeah.
So suddenly thinking there are thousands of people out there who might be reading this, and having to go from, a doctorate where you're covering yourself against any possible question the examiners could throw at you. You're trying to show just how clever you are. So it's referenced heavily, all this, everything. Suddenly from that, I've got to go and summarize 1,000 years of military history in 40,000 words.
Oh, 40,000 words. Wow.
Yeah. So it was a big jump, but it did me the world of good. But I actually thought, well, this is fun. This is why I got interested in history, was to tell stories about it and try and explain to people why it's fun, why it interests me.
Right. Because first of all, I'm kind of surprised that there weren't more volumes out there on Roman military history, right? That seems surprising to me that there was a dearth of that. But a great advantage for you because that was your...
I know. Again, the chance that my thesis had been on this subject, my interests were there, and that there's a market. There's more of a market for military history, really, especially at that sort of lower level, than there is for, say, just even political, let alone social, economic stuff.
Interesting. I was just going to say the idea of taking 1,000 years into 40,000 words, there's a profound creativity that has to be involved to do that, right? Because you're dealing with nonfiction, but you have to determine what are the pivotal events, what are the interesting events, and how does it all thread through so you can see, how this all kind of came together. That's an enormous task, but yeah, I really think creativity must have played a huge part of that.
Well, it took me 4 or 5 drafts just to get it.
Yeah.
But it was really liberating because you were trying to say, well, in a sense, what would have been the book I would have liked to have read before I'd gone off to university, before I'd done all this stuff. So right. It's that, and it's, I'd had a go at writing a novel before and not got anywhere at all with it. But that was just, I came back when I finished my doctorate. I had no money, no job for a year or so, and all this pent up energy but I didn't have any money to sort of travel anywhere, and I wasn't going to rough it that much. So I wrote a novel that probably was terrible and did that, sending it around to everybody, not really having a clue how you go about this, would get other people's rejection letters back. Where they just shoved it in the wrong envelope or a sample of this or somebody else's book. And
it's been photocopied 20 times over and it's barely I know. I've been there.
Yeah. So it's that, which in a sense made things easier because I got that first stage out of my way, then got a job for a bit. So I had a salary. And then, as I say, at the end of this job, the contract came along, and it's one of the problems is that in the academic world, you're not encouraged to write well. And you're almost looked on with suspicion if you communicate because, well, the ideas can't be very good. If it's easy to understand or read.
Right. Lots of passive voice. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. My supervisor was better than most, and he actually said, think of it like a book and maybe imagine that somebody might want to read this.
Yeah.
But for a lot of people, it's been, and when I go around and give talks in universities, you'll meet people saying, I'd love to write for a wider audience and, basically sell books. but most of them actually want to write their little niche research topic and just get paid for it. And rather than thinking, well, who's going to buy this? Who's going to read this?
Right. And what's my source of pride in having published? I mean, so, I started off in a career in hospitality real estate. And so we were writing market reports about here's what's happening economically and I had the exact same kind of realization is like, well, if somebody's reading this, why can't it be accessible so so it can be actionable information? Why does it have to be so dense and passive voiced? Because that was just the template, right? This is how these reports are. Like, well, if I were reading this, I would want to know, here are the main things you have to know. Boom, boom, boom. And so I love the challenge of making it accessible because regardless of what you're talking about, it's kind of all storytelling. Here's the story about this market. Here's the story about, whatever. And why wouldn't anyone want to read an interesting story as opposed to an uninteresting one? I never understood why it had to be so dense. So I'm interested about this novel you wrote. You talked about the energy you had and you had the time. What was the impetus for it? Was it an idea or was it like, hey, I want to see if I can do this. I want to say that I've written a novel, or was it, what was it?
It was I think it just, back in those days as well, it was before, this would have been 1994.
Mm-hmm.
Then there was very little in the way of historical adventure stories, military stories. You had people like Bernard Cornwell had done his Sharp series, and there was the older stuff, C.S. Forrester with Horn, but there was very little. And you clearly got the impression, and I know any new author or aspiring author thinks this, but there was clearly a sense that for publishers, as far as they were concerned, this was somewhat lower than publishing pornography. It was basically, they just didn't want anything to do with this.
Mm-hmm.
So I was partly writing a book that I thought wasn't there, but also it was just to see. I'd gone through that phase, as you often do when you're young, of looking at, same as, you watch a film or you read a book and you think, I could do better than this.
Mm-hmm.
So it was, well, okay, I better try then.
Right.
But I think the lesson of that was that I probably couldn't do it better than this at the time then anyway.
But do you remember how many words that was?
Probably about 20,000, something like that.
Oh, okay. So a big book. So, but I think you're absolutely right, though, in terms of, hey, I got that out of the way, because first of all the stuff that you learn from that you probably don't give yourself credit for is pretty significant, right? You finished a 120,000 word novel, which is, finishing a book is the biggest impediment to anyone writing. Like, I know the amount of writers I know who just don't finish the book, because everything's got to be perfect, and not knowing that it won't be perfect no matter what you do. And how much you absorbed in terms of, crafting a story. And it probably wasn't good. My first 3 books didn't sell, but how much did I learn writing those that helped me sell my 4th book? I don't, they shouldn't have sold, and I'm glad that they didn't, because they weren't ready to be. But you probably learned a lot from that.
I think so. It's so long ago now, it's hard to remember. And then when as I say, I wrote another one. This would have been about 2004, something like that. Because
so 10 years later.
Yeah, had another, because I'd written all these other books, and I was doing early on about a nonfiction book a year, which is quite tight.
Yeah.
When you've got to do but at first I was building on research I'd already done.
Right.
But even so, it was like doing another thesis every year, basically.
Right.
So I sort of knew how this worked, but it wasn't, tenable in the long term. So I had another go, and I thought, well, whereas I'd written something set in Napoleon's army and all this sort of thing, I thought, well, let's go to the ancient world. This is the thing I really know, and do a story of there was a British leader called Caratacus who gets defeated by the Romans when they invade Britain. But when he's sent to Rome, instead of being executed, he's pardoned. And I was assuming that he lives on for decades and sort of tell. It was basically, rather than the famous I Claudius, this was I Caratacus, basically.
Oh, okay. Right.
And some of it was probably good. Some of it, I suspect, was awful. But it got me an agent, if rather indirectly. I think only because first of all, from the agent I'm still with, and she's been marvelous, I sent this in and got a rejection letter from them. So I was about to sort of look through the Artists and Writers Yearbook, find some more. And then a few weeks later, the phone went and they said, why haven't you sent us any more chapters? So, and partly I think they'd realized that I also did the nonfiction, because it turned out the agent's married to someone who was then in the publisher I was with for nonfiction. Right. So there's this strange incestuous thing about
right.
And maybe thought, well, I don't know about this novel, but you could probably make something of him as a history writer. Because then I went and met and signed up for that. And as I say, she didn't sell, though I got a much better class of rejection letter when it came via an agent than you'd ever had before.
Yeah, so they read your book first of all, which is amazing, and and again with my first 3 novels that were rejected, if you can discard your ego, which for me was very easy to do because I didn't know what I was doing as a writer, and actually see like this New York editor read my book and wrote 3 full paragraphs on why they didn't like it. That's tremendously valuable information, right? Yeah. Especially if they all start saying the same thing.
Yeah, exactly. You've got to take the hint at that point.
Yeah. And like, okay, how does that inform how do I write my next book? And it totally did. So it sounds like, that might have been helpful for you as well.
Well, it was. It took about another 5 years or so, and I'd written several nonfiction books, as I say, at a much better level. This suddenly turned from being a student existence to a very nice career, thank you very much, with the history books. And then went up to London, met my agent for lunch, and I was going to say, look, I think I'd like to write another novel again. And she actually raised it first. So she obviously had enough sense of how I was going, why don't we give it another shot? Which made me feel that she hadn't just taken me on for the history in the first place, that there was something about this confused and overlong novel I'd written before that Lisa. But then I surprised her by saying, well, I don't want to write about the ancient world. Can I write something about Napoleonic Wars and Duke of Wellington's army and this sort of thing? And that it was hard selling that first novel, which I wrote, and then she tried to sell. But eventually I, by chance, got an agent who was on the wavelength to get what I was trying to do. And who has hugely influenced, even though I'm not with that publisher, not with him anymore, the way I write. So my books are quite dialogue heavy because that's what he liked.
And that's accessible too, right? To a reader who's... I
think so. I mean, it's... But so that took a while, and that one was rewritten a lot, and there were various other people saying, well, why don't you put this in and this thing? So it's still, I always hoped people would have patience because it was the first of a series and read this, realize it's a bit slow, it's setting things up. And I hope that everything I write, the next book is always better because you're just learning.
Right. Well, and that's an exciting prospect too, right? Is that you always have this feeling of like, I'm not,
you don't look back and think, the best thing I've ever going to do has happened. And
right.
This is about it.
I always say that's one of the best things about being a writer, because you can be 70 and be like, the best maybe yet to come, I think that's exciting. And I have so much respect for what you do. And it's a lot of it's very inaccessible to me in terms of, first of all, writing nonfiction, just the amount of work, and I guess it's like everything. You're doing a book a year, nonfiction, and I guess what's that?
Not anymore. I take about 3 years now,
but at the time, but just knowing how to do that and how to structure it and how to source everything is beyond my comprehension. But then transitioning, or at the same time writing a novel that's rooted in that same nonfiction, but then like dialogue heavy, that's how do I capture those voices? You might have a full understanding of the events, but to capture the voices, did you find that challenging?
Yeah, I mean it was scary, but it was exciting. It was that sort of sense of, because I'd had these novels rejected before. I didn't know whether this one, and the 6 novels I did in that series, eventually they decided the publisher didn't want any more, which left me, I'd planned it out to be about 12. But that was partly why I wanted to do something that wasn't the period I was writing nonfiction about. I mean, I've come to that now, and I've written these Roman books, but I was a bit scared that I wouldn't be able to keep the 2 separate.
Yeah.
and that I am the worst possible audience for most historical novels, but particularly anything set in the ancient world, because
you'll
tiny things will bother me out of all proportion to their significant, that I just can't get past it. So it was nice to go to a different period. And the advantage of writing about Regency England is that you can get some sense of how people spoke.
Yeah.
In a way you just can't with the Romans. You've basically got to make up how your character is going to talk, the manners they have. Because we don't, there are novels from the ancient world, but they're so stylized, they don't really tell you anything. The drama, the comedy is also quite stylized. And most of it, by the period I'm writing about, is centuries old anyway. So it'd be like putting Shakespearean English into a novel that's contemporary. So with the Romans, you just don't really know. And there's so much as well that as an academic, I'm going to say, when I'm writing about this and get to the point, I think it's very important for a historian to say, we don't actually know how they did this, what was going on. We don't know which year this happened. You can't have that in a novel. You can't just open a door and there's nothing there. You've got to. So I was always a bit worried I'd invent things, and then 10 years later I'll forget I've invented them, and I'll be scouring through ancient sources for, there must be a reference to this. I'm sure it's there somewhere. So it was nice at first doing history, but a completely different period.
How are you able to, I feel like there needs to be a level of forgiveness almost as you're writing a novel because I could very much picture you wanting that tiny little detail to be right, even though it only takes somebody like you to notice that it's not right. Has there been a level of forgiveness where you've been able to not do that to serve the story? Or do you slave away over making sure everything is historically accurate, even though you're writing a novel?
I try to make it at least possible that it could have happened that way.
Right. You want it to be believable.
And that's easier with the Romans because there's so much we don't know about all the settings of my novels. I mean, I've just finished draft one now about a period where we know there's about 3 paragraphs describing what happened in these 4 or 5 years in an ancient source. That's it. Very little. So it is really making things up. I've invented a fictional city. I've invented, there are some genuine, real people in there, but it's all. So that's easy. Doing the earlier ones, there was one bit in the second novel I wrote. I remember the editor coming back to me and saying, oh, look, you've got these characters stranded up in the mountains and all this sort of thing. Can't we have a storm or something like that? And I had, by chance, I'd come across someone who'd published a diary written by a real officer who was actually with the unit where my characters are. And he described the weather every day. And I went back and said, look, I'm sorry, that can't happen. It was good weather, and that mattered.
It mattered to you.
It's easier for me if I can, in a sense, I've sort of reconstructed it. Then I've added my fictional bits, and then I'm describing it. It's already there as a picture in my head.
Yeah.
Rather than consciously inventing, if that makes sense. I don't know.
What kind of feedback do you get from your editors in terms of, this is all well and good that this is perfectly placed, but I need more action? Or is there always that kind of balance with them?
It depends. I mean, I did 6 with the same editor, the Napoleonic ones, and he was much more interactive in terms of the editor I've had since, who partly says, well, I'm not really that keen on historical fiction, so I'm just going to trust you.
Whatever you say, man.
The problem is the British experience, British editors, British publishing in general is very different in nature from any publishing company I've ever dealt with in the States that are businesslike and reply to your emails and things like this.
Oh, wow.
Not always quickly, but you get a response. And the scariest one being from my non-fiction editor, who replied to an email I'd rather naively sent. I knew she was expecting a baby, but I thought it was in a couple of months' time. And it turned out she actually replied on the day she'd given birth and stepped back this long. So I am now permanently at a moral disadvantage, and anything she says I've got to do. It's basically this. But with the other ones, I think probably because I have been a bit bolshy when it comes to history, and I've said, look, that's the way it was. That's what I'm going to try and do. I don't mind for the benefit. The first novel, the first one, the Napoleonic one, there was an extra plot in this sort of mission with some Russian spies and all this sort of thing, which I had not been there originally. And I think it come, first of all, a suggestion from my agent, and I wrote it. Eventually, weirdly, the editor came back at the very end to say, look, I don't think this works. It shouldn't be there. It was always grafted on. But because there was just one line at the very end of this that I loved and I felt really proud of, I made them keep it.
Yeah.
And I think it's often been criticized in, you still get reviews and things like, this seems out of place. But it's a strange thing, because in the nonfiction, I definitely don't want anybody. I once had an editor who just went completely cowboy on it and rewrote lots of things, was changing what I was saying in sentence, not just to tidy up, but the meaning of things.
Sure.
And I thought, well, I've spent years studying this. You've just read this. And that's the only time I've sent back copy edits and said, look, I can't deal with this, because to correct all the mistakes that have been introduced is going to take so long that I'll miss the ones that I did put in there myself and I just haven't spotted in the earlier drafts. But otherwise, to say publishing is strangely casual in Britain. So a lot of stuff gets published that's hardly been edited at all.
Oh.
Which is worrying, because you then think, well, all those mistakes you will have made, and you know perfectly what you meant to say,
right,
and what's going on, and what
your title is actually editor. Can you please help me?
Well, it's an odd mixture. So of the Roman ones I've done, one was quite heavily edited, and we got on well. We sorted out in the end and came to a compromise, but I felt she was trying to turn it into something it wasn't, that was more like some other stuff that's out there, which is very good in its way, but it isn't me.
Yeah. Yeah. The other thing that's interesting, I think, about you is that you've managed to, unlike 95% of authors, you've managed to make this a career and a consistent one. It seems like.
I'm still amazed that it's happened, to be quite honest.
And it's a fair, I'm not going to say it's niche, but I'm curious to see or hear from you about how the market has changed, because when you first sent out that very first novel, which may or may not have been good, regardless, there might not have just been a market for it, right? And as we know, the market changes for historical fiction. For look what Da Vinci Code did to different types of novels. How has that changed with what you're writing over time?
It's hard to tell, because you're dealing not simply with the market, which can only buy what it's given or what it's offered,
right?
But also the perceptions of that at the publishing level, that I often think sometimes it's very good, but sometimes you're dealing with editors, and these days often committees of publicists and goodness knows what, to commission something. And they are mainly people who don't actually read the sort of book they're making. Right. But then tell you what the audience wants. And sometimes they may be right, but sometimes I think they're not. I mean, the first two I wrote and couldn't sell, one of the standard things was historical fiction doesn't sell. And this sort of adventure story doesn't sell. Now, with the first batch of rejects, when it was just me, fair enough, they're just saying anything to fob you off and to get rid of you. And they probably haven't read it at all. But when it was coming with sometimes some comments, when the agent had sent it out, there was still that perception. And then there were a couple of authors who did very well with fiction set in the ancient world, like Conigleden, Simon Scarrow, people like that. And suddenly there was a perception the market was there. I suspect the desire had probably always been there. It's just there weren't any books to read, so they couldn't sell. I don't know. I mean, it helps with when there's a TV series or a movie that does well. Movies like Gladiator. Yeah, help boost things. Right. My nonfiction was boosted when a book called Rubicon by Tom Holland came out and did really well and amazed publishers. So they were then looking for other ancient people to write about the ancient world in an accessible way. Right. So I sort of always feel there's this cross-fertilization with when other people come out with stuff. Sometimes it's similar to what you've been thinking about or doing. And if it does well enough, then there's a perception, okay, maybe we'll give it a try. Because then for about 5-10 years, they published loads of historical fiction in Britain. Right. And a lot of it was awful. And some of it's really good. And as with any of those things, that's a matter of taste. But some of it you're looking through and thinking, they think anything like this was going to sell, and
Right.
Some of it didn't. So they've now moved to a much more cautious level. There's less out there, and they're trying to decide, well, who's actually going to. So it's you never quite know what's going to happen next, and it's there a bit with the nonfiction as well, but that's a bit steadier.
Yeah, and I think ultimately what lies on top of all of it is, and as much of a cliche as it sounds like, the story has to be there, right? I mean, because I remember immersing myself in James Clavell, and some of it was inaccessible in terms of if you were to describe what this novel is about, most people would say, or Ken Follett's Pillars of the Earth. You think about, here's an 800-page story about cathedral building. That doesn't sound like, and probably that wouldn't have sold without his name attached to it. But some of these stories are wonderful human stories, and you can't just think, okay, the market is now here for cathedral building stories. No, the market's here for a good story. And hopefully, the setting is a character in and of itself, but the story has to be there.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's when you've got to write those dreadful letters and proposals trying to sell a concept to somebody, you have to put in those, well, it's just like this and it's just like that, and this has created, this movie or this TV series has created demand. But I don't know. I mean, I certainly, both the nonfiction and the fiction, I've only ever written books that I would like to read.
Right.
And it's terribly vain, but I'm probably my biggest fan, sometimes perhaps the only one, because they're the books that I would love to read but aren't there, that somebody hasn't done. And maybe people have done similar, but there's just that, and you just hope that other people like them as well.
But I think that's a fair point. And I've been criticized before too when I'm asked, like, well, who do I write for? And my answer, I write for myself. It sounds disingenuous, but it's completely true, because I don't outline. So I'm there exploring every day, like, what happens next? And that's the joy. I'm like, I would want to read this, or I would want to see this on the screen if this were to happen. And then hopefully it resonates with other people. But I think if you do ultimately write for yourself and you have good taste, it's hard not to have something that's compelling when you're done. So,
well, hopefully the sort of the craft of it all improves as you go along, because I've never done any of the creative writing or all that sort of all these courses and things you can do. And to be honest, I think it's just something you've got to learn by doing it.
100%.
Playing around with words and trying it, and sometimes writing stuff that no one will ever see.
Right.
But you just
that's how you get a voice, right? If I were to read 10 books on how to write, it's you're going to sound completely disaffected in terms of voice. But if after time you're like, I like the cadence of this, I like the staccato of this, and then you get feedback, obviously, but you do develop that voice. And I agree. And it takes book upon book upon book, and it's constantly changing. So, but that's what's exciting about it.
Yeah, exactly. I think you've got to fall in love with each project, each thing you're doing, whatever it is, and probably hate it when it's getting to that point about 3/4 of the way through and it can't finish soon enough, but you've still got to, you can't sort of sit down one morning and just throw it all out, it's there. There's that. I write faster and faster as I get into a story. The start is always really painful.
It is.
And usually I'll go back and I'll rewrite most of those early chapters because they just don't. And there'll be several attempts, and there's a lot of staring at a blank page, and just it's why it's nice to have a good view from the office window, because at least you can look out and look at the sea, sort of thing. Exactly. But you've got to sit there. I think if you don't sit there and make yourself, you're probably thinking through things, or you're trying, or somehow I don't know, so much of it to me anyway isn't that conscious. You do have these good ideas and think, oh yeah, that character could do this, but then a lot just seems to happen.
Right.
And after a while, you feel the characters are almost making up their own story.
Right.
And they just you just let them loose somehow, and that's what they do. It's
because that's a muscle, right? And that probably was not the case with your very first novel. My very first novel, it was every sentence was like drawing blood. And after a while, that unconscious writing comes from years of building that muscle of allowing those characters to speak, that you need in order for that to happen, I think.
I think I write faster now as well.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Which again,
like
I'm not quite sure how, but it just seems, and there's less. You generally feel you've got to go back less and change it all or improve it all. It's
like anything, you get better over time. If you're critical of yourself and you're honest with yourself, you can only really improve. So now we're going to do a quick storytelling. I've actually so rather than picking a random book, I actually selected 3 books, and I'll let you choose one, and we're going to pick a random sentence from there. So your offerings are Neil Gaiman's Neverwhere, Gillian Flynn's Gone Girl, or Robert Harris's Pompeii. Speaking of,
I haven't actually read any of them, so I'm in the sort of.
Fair enough.
I don't think it's fair to do Pompeii, because if it starts off very Roman, that's not really a sort of.
You're going to leave me in the dust. Okay, so not.
Yeah, Pompeii. Well, no, just in terms of I might start talking about things that no normal sane person should know about or will ever remember. I don't mind the Neil Gaiman. I don't mind.
All right, so Neil Gaiman. So pick a number between 1 and 300.
Right. 115 is the year of the novel that's coming out in August, so that'll give us that.
And then pick a sentence between 1 and 5.
Let's go for 5. If it's a bad one, just jump something else.
So it's kind of random. They're all random. That's the whole point of it. So I'm going to read the first sentence, and then you give me a sentence or two, whatever you want to do, and then I'll do a couple, and then after a couple minutes, I'll call the end of the story. But and it can go wherever we want it to go. It was not a particularly clean handkerchief. It had been a present from his Aunt Maud on his last birthday.
And Aunt Maud always said that his handkerchiefs needed to be burned after he'd had them for a day or two.
He took the handkerchief and did what he needed to do with it, then shoved it in his pocket. He looked at his wife and said, "This might be the very last time.
But I hope it'll work. But you know me and anything mechanical, it probably is going to break on us again."
She told him she was worried about him and that she didn't want him to go, but he insisted that he must. He left the house, started up the car, and wondered if she had spotted the lies he'd been telling her.
But in the end, he had a job to do. And if he didn't do it, the people who'd hired him weren't going to be pleased.
He drove off, took a right, double backed, hoping nobody was following him. It took only 20 minutes, but he wished it had taken forever. By the time he got to the door that he needed to knock on, he could feel the sweat trickling down the back of his neck, making his shirt stick to him.
He waited, drew a deep breath, and knocked.
He heard the footsteps from inside, and the door opened. What surprised him was that it was a child who finally opened the door. About 13 years old, a girl. She called him by his name.
His hands still hesitated before going into the pocket of his trench coat. She looked so young. It wasn't innocent that was the word he would use. There was just youth and life.
"Follow me," she said, and he did. Down a corridor to another room where there was 2 chairs set and a small table between them, but nobody else. She sat in one of the chairs, told him to come inside, and then asked him if he had been expecting somebody else.
"I was assuming your father would be here. Is he still not back?"
She said, "My father's never coming back. I thought you knew that. Please sit down, because if you don't do this job, then neither of us are ever going to leave this house."
He noticed that the blind was up on the window beside them, thought he saw something, perhaps a darker shadow in the shadows or just movement. He waited.
I'm going to call it there. I think that's great. I love ending it where it's like, what the hell is going on?
Yeah, well, I'm still confused.
But it's fun, right? Because you never know where it's going to go.
Yeah. That's one of the sort of the burdens. I mean, it's good in a way, but do you find often you just have these ideas and you keep thinking that would be a good story, or wouldn't that be a great scene? And you're not quite sure where they're going, or you think about something and think, I could write something on that, or wouldn't that be a good story?
Totally. I've done a lot of these, and it's always fascinating how, like, immediately to my mind, I can just see, like, okay, cinematically, this is, I could picture this girl perfectly.
Yeah.
And then I do get excited about it, but then you have to like, well, now they threw me a curveball. Now I don't know what's happening. And I love the mental challenge of it all. But yeah, in terms of my writing, I usually don't even think during the day about my stories until I sit down to write, which is only about an hour a day. Then it just kind of all engulfs me and I get to escape for about an hour or so. But otherwise, I'm rarely thinking about them. And I don't know quite why that is, because I know other authors who are constantly leaving notes to themselves and things like that.
Oh, no. I don't do that. I sort of think if any idea is good enough, you'll remember it.
Yes.
And while there is that nagging sense of, oh, there was this brilliant idea that you had at midnight when you woke up, but I think it probably wasn't that good if you've forgotten it. Or if it's really good, it'll come back, or it'll in some way shape what you're doing. But it's more that you sort of feel there isn't quite enough time to do all the things you'd like to write about.
Right.
And just because, again, I'm never happy unless I've got a book on the go, or sometimes more than one. You're reading so much and you just want more stories out there. And the thought is, well, I've got to make them, some of them. There's lots of good ones, great, and I'm going to enjoy that. But it's that. So I'm probably going to do something completely different after I've got one more Roman novel to do in this current trilogy, and then I think something completely different. Still be historical, but more recent, different sort of period. And that was only because I went to the agent and said, look, I've got to write this. And there are one or two things I've done that will never be paid for, published, or anything, but it started, and it's the same as if I go for a walk. It seems to calm my thoughts, but I don't ever remember walking along and thinking that's how the character can get out of this, or that's what they've got to do. But you come back and you write.
Right.
And it's there somehow, as if someone else has.
Well, you're certainly a born storyteller. I mean, there's no question about that. And what a great pleasure to get a chance to pick your brain a little bit today and hear about your origin story. And it's fascinating to me. And I love, I have so much respect for somebody who can write nonfiction and fiction and juggle them both and keep them straight. And, the amount of research, it's fascinating to me. So congratulations on all your success.
Well, thank you. But I think it's really turning a hobby somehow or other has turned into a living. I still think that someone's going to call up one day and say, look, sorry, you can't do this anymore. This is ridiculous. You shouldn't be able to get away with this.
Well, you've managed to parlay it for quite some time. So I think
so far, so good.
You're in pretty good shape. So, well, thanks for talking to me and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you very much for having me.
Take care, Adrian.
Bye.
Bye. So there you have it. That was my conversation with Adrian Goldsworthy. Fantastic guy. I really enjoyed getting to know him a little bit better, getting to spend a little bit of time with him. I just appreciated his wisdom and his intelligence, and I'm just in such awe of people who write detailed historic fiction. I just think that's such a tremendous challenge. So hats off to him. Remember to check out his latest book, The Fort, along with his other books on ancient Roman warfare. And if you want to know more about him, you can check him out at adriangoldsworthy.com. If you want to find out more about me, you can just go to carterwilson.com. And I highly recommend you subscribe to my newsletter because I reveal a lot in there and I enjoy doing that and I get good feedback on it. So please visit my website and sign up and you can judge for yourself. More episodes coming out soon. In the meantime, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening.